Okay, a few weeks back I said that we were going to have a few discussions about some topical things that I believe are raised quite often in minimalism. I either see them in various discussions on different sites or even within my own comments section. A few weeks back we covered the urban minimalism versus self-sufficiency debate, but another big one that I often get asked about is the emergency minimalist Bugout bag. Now, I do find it quite an interesting topic, but it's not always one that's applicable to me for the obvious reason I live in England and in general we don't have many emergency situations, but I still think it's interesting to discuss. For instance, quite a while back now, I think nearly a year ago, I did a video about the biggest extreme minimalist in Japan called Sibu, and he is very, very extreme, but even he, because he obviously comes from somewhere like Japan, which is known for earthquakes, tsunamis, he has a minimalist Bugout bag, and everybody's that has one I've noticed looks a little bit different. His, with him being sort of a tech designer or something like that, it's very sleek. It's this long pole that he keeps little things in that he might need, like a long kind of almost artist portfolio or architect's pole, but he uses it so it's long and sleek, he can store it away easy, and it keeps the things he might need for the Japanese environment and climate, that type of Bugout. Now, I know that some people really go in depth about this, but I think perhaps even there is an extreme minimal version of a Bugout bag. And even in the past, when I have gone sort of going around hiking and camping shops in our region, there are little what they call survival kits that you can get that are basically the basic necessities of what you might need in an emergency situation. Now, I think the only way that might come about in my own landscape of sort of the Yorkshire Dales, which are almost like mountains, the very large hills, is if you were actually going on a hike, an emergency event occurred and you were in the middle of nowhere. And people do buy little survival packs for that in case people like the mountain rescue couldn't find you for sort of a few hours or a day. And they generally come in little bottles. And in those little bottles you have things like a flint, some water tablets in case you found some water nearby but you could purify it, and a little silver blanket to sort of keep you warm in, you know, a cold environment where you might get pneumonia. So they're like the basic things you might need in an environment such as ours. But I think that really when people think about Bugout bags, they think about something not necessarily that you take with you when you go on adventures like that, but rather one that you keep in your house because your area might be prone through history to natural disasters, and it's something that you would take with you. Now, in my lifetime in the UK, we have only ever had 2 minor earthquakes, and I think one of them, although technically it wasn't minor, it was like 6, because it was quite far out, it only had minor effects because of the distance it had to travel, even in the area that it was. So the most that happened is, you know, people's rooms shook a little bit, nobody was injured, and I think because we have very good building standards, no buildings fell down and things, so it's not something that we really have to worry about. But it did get me thinking, what sort of stuff would I keep in a Bugout bag if I had to? Would it be more this side with like some basic food supplies, a warm thermal sleeping bag attached to the bottom, or would it be small with just like a flint and a cape and some water tablets? Because I think also the key to thinking about a Bugout bag also depends on your survival instinct and whether you would know places to go, whether there are places to go nearby. Because in relativity the UK is quite small, most things are in walking distance where you could perhaps walk to safety. If you were living in a very large country, then yes, you might have to walk for weeks or even days until you met a safe place to be, whether that was civilization or the opposite, sort of getting away from civilization because that is where the event had took place and you were moving away. I know in major disasters in the past, such as things like Hiroshima, even though the initial impact was what sadly took lots of people's lives, it was actually the water in the weeks and months after that slowly poisoned people, and therefore they had to get away from the civilization and find a place where the water was clearer. So there are lots of different things to consider. I don't really think it is possible to consider them unless you are living in an environment like that. But this is why, because I often get questioned a lot why I don't have a bug out bag, I just don't simply think that I need one. Although ironically, when I do go out walking and hiking a lot with my partner in our area, I'm always on the lookout for forageable plants, like thinking if all of a sudden, you know, our ecosystem collapsed, we didn't have food, how would we survive in the climate that we're in? And I think we would be quite lucky. By no means would it be easy, but obviously we live on the coast, so if it wasn't a disaster to do with the coastal water, we would be able to fish. If we had to simply forage, I've noticed that in our local area there are things like rhubarb. We live in the famous rhubarb triangle, kind of. It's where at one point in the 1800s the most rhubarb came from in the world. So we'd be eating a lot of that. We also have a lot of blackberry bushes and a lot of rosehip. That seems to be the local plant sources. Oh, and a lot of wild garlic. This is something that ironically I like to notice a lot wherever I travel in the world, what the local flora and fauna is. And I noticed that when we go to Greece quite regularly, they have pomegranates and palm hearts absolutely everywhere, so there's a lot of fruit in that situation of something happening there. I also, because one of my hobbies is sort of thinking about natural remedies and herbal remedies, I actually know a lot about what plants are natural medicines and things as well, so you don't necessarily in this bug out bag have to think about kind of hoarding all these medicines and things, because often if you live in the right climate, by right I just mean if you're lucky enough to, then you might actually be able to find some basic things around you in the environment, the countryside, that can be medicinal anyway, obviously within reason. So at least I have a bit of basic knowledge about that. So I said between my partner and I, we would probably be quite good at surviving because I would know about the foraging, but he'd be more good at doing the sort of shelters and maybe the fishing. So, you know, I think that we would manage to survive in this type of environment. Also in this area we have a lot of bivalve type things, so if you weren't that into fishing you could at least collect things like sea snails and mussels by putting the sort of ropes down, and I think it would be quite a good survival environment that you wouldn't actually really need that much to survive. The biggest problem would probably be in the winter when it got quite cold. It can get to sort of -5 Celsius around here, but in general it doesn't go lower than that. So it's copeable if you had a very good sleeping bag, whereas there's some countries where if you were outside you would obviously catch hypothermia. And there are obviously countries where no food grows, it's either too hot or too cold, so then you definitely have to consider that as part of your bug out bag and survival rations, maybe even having packs of sort of dried food and things. And especially if it was a kind of catastrophe that ruined the local flora and fauna, you would have to think about that. But my gut feeling is there is just too much to consider. And if you're living in an environment like mine, generally quite a safe environment, you know, earthquakes don't happen once a year, tsunamis don't happen at least once a year, in which case it is a good idea to be prepared for them. Having things like torches and things in case all the lights go out. But in general, stuff like that doesn't happen here, you know, so we don't really have to worry about something that hasn't happened and probably isn't going to happen, or, you know, Lord forbid it did happen. We're quite lucky environmentally and locally in that we would be able to get things quite easily in that scenario. So this is why I personally don't have a minimalist bug out bag. However, when we do go travelling, I probably will keep some kind of tiny small survival kit, first aid kit, in case of things happening if we were really far out in the middle of nowhere. But at the moment, we're not. We're 5 minutes from a town with lots of amenities, there's lots of people nearby that would help us. I think we're okay. But it would be interesting to know anyway, so we'll play a little game for this minimalist bug out bag discussion. Tell me in the comments the top 5 things you would have in your minimalist bug out bag, and I will tell you mine. Mine would probably definitely be a flint for fire, a foil cape like I mentioned to keep warm, water tablets, a knife for if I had to either catch things like fish, defend myself. And I know that on a lot of these survival programs they have hooks or netting as well, or even rope to be able to make things like shelters. So maybe that's my top 5. Maybe that's my top 5. But I'm really sort of going into this and thinking more survival rather than natural disaster, because in general natural disasters don't really happen here, so it's more likely to be a social disaster and people having to survive in that type of situation. So I think I've said all I can really say on this really, because we just simply don't have that situation. See you all in the next one. Bye!